So in terms of the way evolutionary enlightenment works, it's a journey from a life of ignorance or unenlightenment, which is the life of the ego. It's very simply put. So the point of departure in evolutionary enlightenment is from a life of ignorance and unenlightenment. And a life of ignorance we could call, is usually a negative relationship to life. It's a very self-centered, small-minded, self-centered relationship to life. So we call that -1. Minus means negative. Okay? So a life of ignorance and unenlightenment would be -1. So that's the journey. From -1, then we want to go back to 0. We want to die and then be reborn, is the idea. With enlightenment, they always have death and rebirth metaphors, right? I died and I was reborn. You've heard that, right? There's a reason. So we go from a life of ignorance and unenlightenment, then you die, the idea is die, so then you have to go back to 0. When you go back to 0, you go back to before the beginning. That's the idea. You go back to before the beginning. So if you go back to before the beginning, that's your death, and then your rebirth is you enter out reborn, and that's +1. So the journey goes from -1 to 0 to +1. That's the idea of the journey. -1 is a life of ignorance and unenlightenment, to 0, which is you go back to before the beginning, and then when you re-emerge, you're reborn for a completely new life. So the role and the purpose of the meditative state of consciousness in this process is going back to 0, or going back to before the beginning. And that's the whole point and purpose of it in the context of evolutionary enlightenment. So the reason that you meditate in evolutionary enlightenment is so that you can go back to before, so you can die to the old and be reborn into that which is new. Die to that which is old and be reborn to that which is new. That's the reason you're doing it. You want to die to the old and be reborn in that which is new. That's the reason that you're doing it. Now, by the way, the process of death and rebirth doesn't just happen once. It can happen millions, billions of times. How many times in a day could ego emerge? Thousands? Hundreds of thousands? How many times could it die? And how many times could you be reborn? It could happen once in a lifetime. It could happen hundreds of billions of times. But you want to start seeing this as right, there's a process here. And if you understand how the process works, then you'll be a very wise person. If you start paying attention to your own experience, you'll start seeing this kind of thing happening. You'll see yourself identify with ego, and then you'll see yourself die to ego and be lost in this 0, and see yourself reborn as an enlightened person, enlightened self. Now, the reason that the meditative state is so important is because it's a state of freedom. And the reason it's a state of freedom is because in a meditative state, you're not holding on to anything. You have no attachment whatsoever. You have no attachment to life. You have no attachment to death. You have no attachment to anything. So you see, this if my hand is like is your mind, and this is a thought. It could be any thought. Then you let go. You see, there's nothing there. That's what it is. That's the state of freedom. Understand?